It was supposed to be an ordinary school trip. The bus was filled with excited students, their chaperones, and teachers, heading back home after a fun-filled day. The night sky was dark, the road was eerily quiet, and the air had a chill that made everyone feel a little uneasy. The students chatted among themselves, unaware of the horrors waiting for them ahead. Little did they know, the bus they were traveling on was more than just a mode of transportation. It was a vessel of terror. A curse that had been waiting for years to claim its next victims. As the bus made its way down a remote road, things began to go wrong. Strange occurrences escalated quickly, and soon, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The sinister force following them wasn't just an ordinary ghost. It was something far darker, far older. Something that knew their fears, their weaknesses, and the darkness in their hearts. Now, as they struggle to survive the horrors of the night, the question remains. Will they make it out alive, or will they be the next victims of the cursed road? It was an unusually cold evening for mid-autumn, the air thick with fog as the school bus pulled up at the edge of the forest. The kind of fog that made everything look distant, shrouded in mystery, and whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. The engine sputtered slightly as it came to a halt. Inside the bus, the students were silent, a few of them peeking out of the fogged-up windows, wondering where the driver was taking them. Emily sat in her usual seat by the window, her fingers nervously drumming on the armrest. She wasn't sure why, but there was a deep sense of unease gnawing at her. The bus had never taken this route before. The usual route was well lit and filled with the comforting sounds of passing cars, streetlights, and the hum of the world beyond the school. But tonight it was different. The road stretched ahead like an endless path into darkness, the trees that lined the way standing like ominous sentinels, their bare branches twisting toward the sky. She glanced around at her classmates. Most of them were on their phones or lost in conversation. Jason, her best friend, was sitting across from her, his attention firmly locked on the screen of his phone, unaware of her growing discomfort. "Jason," Emily muttered, leaning slightly across the aisle. "Do you think this is normal?" Jason looked up from his phone for a second, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? It's just a trip. We're going to see the haunted house for Halloween, right?" But Emily shook her head. "It's not that. It's the route. This doesn't look like the way we usually take." Jason looked around, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the dim light, the trees pressing in on them. "Maybe it's a shortcut. We're almost there anyway." He shrugged, returning his focus to his phone. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The driver, Mr. Collins, was different tonight too. Normally, he was chatty, joking with the students, but now he was silent, staring ahead with a grim expression. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, and his face looked pale under the dim light of the bus's interior. He had never looked like this before. It was as if something was weighing on him, something he couldn't escape. The bus continued its slow, methodical journey down the winding road, its tires crunching over the gravel. The trees seemed to close in on them, the branches casting eerie shadows across the windshield, making the road ahead appear almost endless. The silence in the bus was uncomfortable now, as if the students sensed it too. Some of them were starting to look out the windows, their faces reflecting the same confusion Emily felt. Suddenly, the bus hit a bump, a harsh jolt that rattled the windows and sent a few of the students stumbling forward in their seats. The eerie silence was broken for a moment by muffled complaints and groans, but the bus continued as though nothing had happened. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, the unease intensifying. She looked back at Mr. Collins. He had barely flinched when the bump occurred, his eyes still fixed ahead, never moving. Emily could have sworn his lips were twitching, as though he were trying to hold back a grin. But that would have been impossible, wouldn't it? The bus rolled on, and as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the dark forest around them seemed to come alive. The trees now appeared more twisted, their branches contorted into unnatural shapes. The moon, hidden behind thick clouds, barely provided any light, casting everything into deep shadow. Is this real?" Emily whispered to herself, trying to make sense of the growing dread. But the question was more rhetorical than anything. She had already known the answer. A sudden scream broke the silence. It wasn't a scream of terror, but a shrill, piercing sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the bus. It was a sound that no one could ignore. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the sound. It had come from the back of the bus. Everyone turned to look, but no one saw anything. The back was as empty as it always was. The seats, the walls, the floor, nothing seemed out of place. What was that? Jason asked, his voice a little shakier than before. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't answer. She could only stare at the empty back of the bus, her mind racing to understand what was happening. Had anyone else heard it? Was it just her imagination? Or was something far worse waiting for them out there in the dark? Maybe it's the wind, someone called from the back, but no one looked convinced. The bus rolled on, deeper into the forest, and the tension grew thicker. Emily could almost hear the trees whispering, the branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle as though they were reaching for the students inside. And then the lights flickered. The first time was brief, almost unnoticeable, but the second time, the lights cut out entirely. The bus was plunged into complete darkness. The students gasped, their voices rising in a mix of fear and confusion. Jason fumbled for his phone, trying to use the flashlight, but it didn't turn on. It was as though everything electronic was suddenly being drained of its power. The air became colder, and a strange, heavy silence fell over them. Emily's breath fogged in front of her face as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her heart hammered in her chest. Then a voice broke the silence. A whisper, low and raspy, came from somewhere in the front of the bus. "Get out," it said. The voice wasn't Mr. Collins's, nor was it any of the students. It was something else, something dark, something that didn't belong. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the whisper echoed in her ears. The bus was silent, the usual noise of the engine now absent, as if the world outside had disappeared entirely. The eerie darkness enveloped the students, and the only thing she could hear was her own shallow breathing. Her hand instinctively reached for the edge of her seat, clutching it tightly, as though it would ground her in the chaos that was about to unfold. "Get out," the voice had said. Emily's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if it was the fear creeping into her bones or something far worse. But the voice was not just a figment of imagination. She had heard it, clear as day, and the others had heard it too. She wasn't alone in this nightmare. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. She could hear the rustle of the students shifting in their seats, the shuffle of feet on the floor, but no one spoke. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, as if they, too, knew that something was coming. Something that none of them could understand, let alone stop. Jason, still fumbling with his phone, cursed under his breath when the screen refused to light up. "This is crazy. My phone's dead," he muttered. "No signal. No lights. Nothing." Emily turned to him, her eyes wide with dread. "What do we do? Where's the driver?" Jason's eyes darted nervously towards the front of the bus. Mr. Collins had not moved since the lights went out, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. His face was still pale, his eyes glazed over, as if he were no longer fully present. The bus had come to a complete stop, and no one had seen him make any effort to drive again. Suddenly, the low hum of the engine returned. It wasn't loud enough to drown out the nervous whispers from the back of the bus, but it was enough to break the dead silence. The headlights flickered back to life, but the light they cast was weak, casting long shadows that made the trees on either side of the road seem even more menacing. But the bus didn't move. The tension inside the vehicle was unbearable. Emily's eyes scanned the dark, trying to make sense of the silhouettes outside the window. The fog was thick now, like a wall of white smoke, and the road ahead seemed to disappear into nothingness. The only thing she could make out clearly were the trees, their branches twisting into impossible shapes, like skeletal arms reaching toward them. The whisper came again. "Get out!" This time, it was louder, sharper, as though it were coming from inside the bus itself. Emily looked around frantically. No one else seemed to be reacting, but she could feel their fear, hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Jason was staring ahead, his mouth slightly agape, as though he too could feel the presence that surrounded them. The other students remained frozen, their faces pale and wide-eyed, unable or unwilling to speak. "Where's the driver?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "We need to get off this bus. Something's wrong." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. But as she looked up at Mr. Collins, she realized with a sickening sense of dread that he was no longer in control of the situation. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter now, his knuckles white. His face was still expressionless, and his eyes were empty, as though whatever was driving the bus was not him. Then, without warning, the doors of the bus creaked open. The suddenness of the movement startled everyone. A cold gust of wind blew through the opening, carrying with it the scent of decay and earth. The door remained ajar, as if inviting them to step out into the unknown. "What the hell?" Jason muttered under his breath. Emily's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to shout for someone to do something, but her voice caught in her throat. There was something about the open door that terrified her more than the darkness outside. It was as if the bus was daring them to leave, challenging them to walk into whatever lay beyond. "Should we get off?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "I mean, it might be safer than sitting here in the dark." Emily glanced at the others, her gaze falling on their fearful expressions. They were all staring at the door now, as if hypnotized by its silent call. The bus was a trap, and the outside world seemed to be no better. But there was something inside her, a gut feeling, that told her that if they stepped off that bus, they might never come back. She turned to Jason, her voice barely a whisper. "No, we stay on the bus. We wait for Mr. Collins to snap out of it. He'll know what to do." But even as she said it, a part of her doubted her own words. Would Mr. Collins know what to do? Was he even still in control of the bus? Was he, too, just a puppet of whatever force had taken hold of the vehicle? The wind outside howled again, louder now, as if it were calling them. The trees groaned in response, their branches swaying unnaturally in the breeze. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Then the whisper came again. "Leave now before it's too late." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on them from all sides, forcing them to listen, forcing them to obey. The fear in the air was palpable, thickening with every passing second. Jason stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He moved toward the door, as if something inside him was urging him to go. But just as he reached the steps, something stopped him. The bus jerked violently, throwing him back into his seat. The force was enough to make Emily's breath catch in her throat. She turned to see Mr. Collins, his eyes wide and wild now, staring at them as though he had just woken up from a trance. "Get back in your seats," Mr. Collins growled, his voice low and hoarse. "We're not done yet." But even as he spoke, Emily saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. There was no recognition there, no understanding. Just empty, hollow sockets staring at them as if they were already dead. The bus lurched forward. The haunting deepens. The bus continued to roar down the road, but Emily could feel something was wrong. Something far beyond the eerie fog or the strange happenings of the last few minutes. There was an unnatural stillness that had settled within the bus. The hum of the engine sounded distant, like it was coming from another world altogether. Jason sat frozen, his eyes wide with terror as he glanced nervously at Emily. He wasn't the type to show fear, but now, his usually confident demeanor had evaporated. His face was pale, his hands trembling. What's happening? This isn't real. This can't be real." Emily didn't have an answer. Her mind was racing, trying to grasp the impossibility of the situation. They were trapped in a world that didn't make sense, where reality seemed to bend and break around them. Mr. Collins had lost any semblance of composure. His hands gripped the steering wheel like a vice, his knuckles white from the pressure. His eyes were wide, darting to the rearview mirror, then to the fog ahead, then back to the side mirrors. He was panicking. Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. The words were lost in a trance-like state, as if he were caught in a conversation with something invisible. Then, just as suddenly as the fog had swallowed them up, the headlights of the bus flickered. A dull hum filled the bus as the lights flickered again, and the shadows inside the bus grew longer, stretching along the walls. The walls seemed to move, undulating as though they were alive. Emily's heart raced. She turned to look out the window, but all she could see was a thick, dense fog. The road ahead was swallowed by the endless white, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed through the bus. It was like a scream, distant and otherworldly. Emily jumped, her pulse pounding in her ears. The sound didn't come from inside the bus. It came from somewhere outside, the forest? Her gaze shot to Jason. He had heard it too. His eyes locked onto hers, fear reflected in his expression. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, voice shaking. "I did," Emily replied, but she couldn't voice what she was truly thinking. Something was out there. There was no answer. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. The bus was moving slower now, almost like it was creeping forward, as if trying to avoid whatever was outside. The bus came to a sudden halt again. It wasn't a regular stop, but a violent, jarring stop that threw everyone forward in their seats. Emily gasped as her head collided with the seat in front of her. Jason reached out, steadying her. "What the hell?" Jason muttered, his voice tense. Emily looked around. The bus was empty. She blinked, confused. There had been passengers earlier. Where had they gone? But it wasn't just that. The bus itself felt wrong. The air was thick and oppressive, like the atmosphere inside had changed entirely. The windows were fogged up, but it was different now. They weren't just fogged, they were almost opaque. She couldn't see a single thing outside. "Mr. Collins?" Emily called out. Nothing. Not even a twitch from him. He was still gripping the steering wheel, but his posture had changed. It wasn't the posture of a man trying to regain control. It was the posture of someone who had already surrendered. Jason leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. "We need to get off this bus. Now." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She glanced around the bus again. It felt like a cage, a place designed to trap them. The seats, the walls, the doors, it all felt suffocating. Jason unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up slowly. Emily followed suit. She moved cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The door at the front was still shut, and she reached for it. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal, and she shuddered as she touched it. The door wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, panic starting to rise in her throat. She could hear Jason's breath behind her, quick and shallow. He had reached for the emergency exit at the back of the bus, but the door there was locked too. The entire bus was sealed shut. "Let us out!" Emily screamed, slamming her fists against the door. "Please! Someone help us!" But there was no answer. The bus was silent again, except for the sound of her frantic breaths and Jason's uneven footsteps. Emily turned back to face the aisle. That's when she saw it. The figure. It was standing at the end of the aisle, near the back of the bus. The figure was tall and distorted, like it was made of shadows and fog. Its features were hidden in darkness, but Emily could feel its presence. It was as though the very air around her had become colder, denser. The temperature had dropped several degrees in the blink of an eye. She gasped, stumbling backward. Jason froze. Neither of them moved. The figure took a step forward. The air grew even colder. The lights flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows along the bus. The figure moved closer, its form becoming more distinct. Its limbs were elongated, like they stretched unnaturally, and there was something in the way it moved that made Emily's blood run cold. The figure didn't walk, it glided. "Jason," Emily whispered, but the words barely escaped her lips. "What is that?" Jason swallowed hard, his face a mask of terror. "I don't know, but we need to get off this bus. Now." But before they could make a move, the figure spoke. "Leave now." The voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from the very depths of the earth. It sent a chill down Emily's spine. She couldn't tell whether the voice was male or female. It had no discernible tone, just a cold, empty echo. The figure raised a hand, and with a sudden, terrifying movement, it pointed at Emily. "Leave now or never leave." The dark revelation. Emily's heart raced as the figure's hand pointed directly at her. Every muscle in her body screamed to run, but her legs were frozen in place. The coldness of the bus was now unbearable, each breath coming out as a visible mist in the air. Jason's hand gripped her arm, his fingers trembling as he whispered, "Don't look at it, Emily. Don't look." But Emily couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure. Its form was shifting, distorting, its edges blurring as if it wasn't meant to exist in this world. She could feel its presence growing stronger with every passing second, pressing in on her, suffocating her. It was like the air itself was heavy, thick with a malevolent force. The figure didn't move, but its voice echoed through the bus again, louder this time, more demanding. "Leave now or never leave." The words were like a command, a curse that wrapped around them both, binding them to the bus. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She knew in that moment that whatever this thing was, it was not from this world. It was something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. "Mr. Collins!" Emily screamed, her voice cracking in terror. "Mr. Collins, please! Help us!" But the bus driver was still silent. His eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead, but there was no sign of recognition in them, no trace of the man who had been speaking just moments ago. It was like he was gone. Something had taken him, leaving only an empty shell behind. The figure took another step toward them, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the aisle. It was getting closer, its presence more oppressive with every inch it moved. Emily could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, her mind racing with the need to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The bus was their prison, and the doors were locked, sealed shut by something far stronger than any physical barrier. "Please," Emily's voice trembled, tears welling in her eyes. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. Its face remained hidden in the shadows, but there was something in its posture that was almost human. It was as if it were toying with them, enjoying their fear. "Your soul," it finally replied, its voice sending a chill down her spine. "Your soul's all of you. You are mine." Jason's grip tightened on Emily's arm, his knuckles white. "We have to get off this bus. We have to break the windows or find a way to escape." But before Emily could respond, the temperature in the bus dropped even further. The air felt sharp, biting, and Emily could see her breath hanging in the air like smoke. The walls of the bus seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, alive with some dark energy. The figure began to move again, this time with a horrifying speed. It didn't walk, it floated, gliding toward them with an unnatural grace. As it passed by the other seats, the passengers, once present, had disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but the faintest traces of their presence. There were no bags, no belongings, nothing but the empty, cold bus. Jason pulled Emily back, his face pale with terror. "We need to get out, Emily, now." But Emily couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by fear. She turned to look at the driver's seat once more, but Mr. Collins was gone. The seat was empty. There was nothing but the steering wheel, still gripped tightly by invisible hands. The figure reached them now, standing just inches away. Emily could feel its coldness, an icy chill that seeped into her skin, freezing her from the inside out. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Her mind screamed for her to do something, anything, but her body refused to obey. The figure raised its hand again, pointing directly at her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, but it wasn't just the voice. It was in her mind, in her very soul. "This is your fate. This bus, this night, it will never end." The air in the bus began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from all around them. Emily's head spun, and she felt as though the world itself was unraveling around her. The fog outside the bus had thickened again, and through the fog, she could see shapes, dark, twisted shapes, moving in the distance. Something was out there. The bus began to move again, this time faster than before, hurtling down the road with unnatural speed. The darkness outside seemed to stretch on forever, as though they were trapped in some eternal night. The streetlights, if they could even be called that, flickered sporadically, casting ghostly glows on the fog. Jason clutched Emily's arm, his face contorted in horror. "We need to find a way out. Emily, please." But there was no escape. Not here. Not on this bus. The figure raised its hand again, and this time, its fingers seemed to elongate, stretching out toward Emily. She could feel a presence around her neck, a choking pressure, as if the figure was trying to pull her in, to claim her as its own. Suddenly, everything went black. The final hour. Emily gasped for air as the darkness swallowed her whole. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her body felt as though it was floating, suspended in nothingness, her mind consumed by a strange, suffocating void. Her eyes flickered open, but the world around her remained pitch black. She was disoriented, unable to make sense of where she was. Then, slowly, a faint light emerged in the distance. At first, it was nothing more than a small, flickering glow, like a candle in the darkness. But as Emily's vision adjusted, the light grew brighter, revealing something that made her heart freeze in her chest. The bus was gone. In its place was a vast, endless expanse of dark, swirling fog, stretching out in all directions. She was standing, no floating, on a cold, wet surface, but there were no walls, no trees, no road. Just a never-ending void. She reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though it might collapse at any moment. The eerie silence was broken only by the faint, whispering hum that surrounded her, growing louder, more insistent. The figure. Emily turned around, her pulse racing. She didn't want to look, didn't want to face whatever was following her, but she couldn't stop herself. And there it was. The figure from the bus was standing in front of her. Its form was even more distorted now, more monstrous. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, burning through the fog like twin infernos. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, showing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of its face. Its limbs were long, spindly, impossibly long, reaching toward her like spider legs. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Emily could hear its voice in her mind, clear as day. "You can never leave," it whispered. "This place, this nightmare, it is your prison. Forever." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had to be dreaming. This couldn't be real. But every sensation, every detail around her felt so real. Too real. The coldness, the suffocating air, the pressure building in her chest. This wasn't a dream. Suddenly, a voice broke through the overwhelming silence. "Emily!" Her head snapped around, and there, just a few feet away, was Jason. His eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. He looked just as lost and terrified as she felt. "Jason!" Emily cried, relief flooding her as she stumbled toward him. "Where are we? What's happening?" Jason didn't respond at first. He was staring past her, his eyes wide with horror. It's not real. None of this is real." Emily's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? She turned to look at the figure again, and for a brief second, it seemed to shift, its features warping in a way that made her stomach churn. "No!" Jason screamed. "Don't look at it. Don't let it control you." But it was too late. The figure was already moving toward them, its long limbs stretching toward Jason, pulling him toward its grasp. Emily reached out in desperation, but the air around her was thick, almost solid, and she couldn't move. Jason cried out, his body jerking as if something invisible was choking him. His eyes locked onto Emily's, filled with a desperate plea. "You have to get out. You have to run." But before Emily could react, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The fog shifted, swirling violently around them, as though something was coming. Something worse. The figure's mouth stretched wider, its grin widening into a terrifying maw. It reached out with long, skeletal fingers, wrapping them around Jason's throat. He gasped for air, struggling in vain, but there was nothing he could do. "No!" Emily screamed, lunging toward him, but her body was held in place by some invisible force, as if the air itself was suffocating her. She watched helplessly as Jason's body went limp in the figure's grasp, his eyes vacant, his face pale. He was gone. The figure didn't stop. It slowly turned its head toward Emily, its eyes locking onto hers. There was no emotion in those eyes, just cold, inhuman malice. And then, in a voice that made her blood run cold, it spoke once more. "You will join him soon. There is no escape." The world around Emily began to warp. The fog thickened, and the ground beneath her feet cracked and crumbled, pulling her into the abyss. She felt her body falling, spinning through an endless void, unable to stop, unable to breathe. But just as everything seemed to fade to black, something strange happened. A flicker of light appeared before her, just as it had when she first woke up in the void. The light was bright, almost blinding, and as it grew closer, Emily could feel a strange pull toward it, a feeling of warmth, of safety. The darkness around her began to recede, the fog thinning, the oppressive weight lifting. Emily reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the light. A shock of energy surged through her, and for a moment, everything felt right. Her heart slowed, her mind cleared, and she was filled with an overwhelming sense of peace. But then the light flickered, and the figure was there again, looming behind her, its voice echoing in her mind. "This is just the beginning. You cannot escape me." The light vanished, and the darkness returned, stronger than before. Emily screamed, but there was no one to hear her. The bus had become her nightmare, and it seemed that no matter what she did, she would never wake up. The unseen hand. Emily's breath was shallow, panic gripping her chest as the darkness closed in once more. Her body was heavy, like she was being pulled down into the very bowels of the earth. The crushing weight of the void surrounded her, and with every attempt to break free, she was sucked deeper into its suffocating grasp. The figure was still there, watching her with those glowing, malevolent eyes. But this time, it wasn't moving closer. Instead, it stood, watching her with an eerie stillness, as if it was waiting for something. Emily's mind raced. Escape. I need to escape. But where? How? The ground beneath her feet cracked again, the pressure building until it felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice. She closed her eyes, wishing for the light to return, the one that had appeared moments ago. But there was nothing. Just the endless, swirling darkness and the sound of her own frantic heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then a whisper, soft, barely audible, broke the silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Emily!" Her head snapped up, her eyes searching the void for the source of the voice. She wasn't alone. She couldn't be. Jason's voice. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling. She strained to hear more, but all she caught was another faint whisper. This time it was unmistakable. "Emily, help!" She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog that clouded her vision. The darkness around her swirled in on itself, and for a brief moment, she saw a faint outline of Jason, his face twisted in pain, his body floating in the air, trapped between the realms of the living and the dead. "Jason!" Emily cried out, her voice louder now, desperate. She ran toward him, her heart pounding, but every step felt like she was walking through thick mud, slow and labored. The figure, watching from the corner of her eye, didn't move. It didn't need to. It knew she couldn't escape. It knew she would try. And it knew she would fail. Jason's figure flickered, his body glitching in and out of existence. He was trapped, lost in the void just as much as she was. Emily stretched out her hand, reaching for him, but the distance between them only seemed to grow. She screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "I won't leave you, Jason. I won't leave you here." Her words echoed through the darkness, but Jason's form began to disappear, fading into the fog. Her chest tightened as panic set in. She couldn't lose him, not like this. She couldn't let him fade away without a fight. The whisper came again, louder this time and colder. "Run, Emily. Run." Emily froze, the voice not Jason's, but the figure's. It was clear now, taunting her. The darkness around her grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling violently. "You cannot save him. You are already mine." Emily's heart raced as she turned to face the figure, its twisted grin stretching even wider, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. Her skin crawled, and for a moment, she could swear she felt its cold fingers brush against her neck, a warning, a threat. She shook her head, fighting back the overwhelming sense of dread that was threatening to consume her. But as she stepped back, the ground beneath her feet trembled again. This time, it wasn't just the ground. The entire void seemed to shake, the very air around her rippling with unseen forces. The darkness was alive, and it was closing in. "No!" Emily shouted, her voice cracking. "I won't let you take me. I won't let you win." She turned and ran, her footsteps muffled by the thick, oppressive fog. She couldn't see where she was going, but she didn't care. Anything was better than standing still, waiting for whatever monstrosity the void had in store for her. But the darkness wasn't done. It followed her, a constant presence, creeping along behind her like an invisible hand, pushing her forward. The whispers grew louder, until they were deafening. "Emily! Emily!" She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers surrounded her. Her head spun as she spun around, trying to find where the voices were coming from. But there was no one, just the endless, swirling fog. The figure was there again. She hadn't seen it move, but somehow it was closer now, its presence undeniable. It towered over her, blocking her path, its long arms reaching down toward her, fingers like claws ready to grasp her. "Leave me alone!" Emily screamed, her voice hoarse, panicked. She tried to run, but her legs felt like lead, unable to carry her. The darkness was everywhere now, suffocating her, pressing in from all sides. And then, as if the figure were waiting for this moment, it lunged forward. Its fingers, impossibly long and twisted, wrapped around her wrist like iron chains. Emily screamed, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The more she fought, the tighter its grip became. "You belong to me now," the figure whispered, its voice cold and unfeeling, its breath like ice against her skin. "There is no escape." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she looked around helplessly. She could hear the distant echo of Jason's voice, but it was fading, swallowed by the void. She was alone, trapped, inescapable. And then, just as her strength began to wane, as her body grew weak from the pressure of the figure's grip, the darkness around her parted, just for a second, revealing a sliver of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give her one last push of strength. Emily screamed one final time, with every ounce of her being, as she fought against the figure's hold. She reached for the light, desperate, her fingers trembling. And then in one violent final motion, the figure released her. The light engulfed her, pulling her forward, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily felt free. But as the light grew brighter, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still there, waiting for her return. The return to the bus. The light surrounding Emily was blinding. She could feel it pulling her forward, lifting her, as though it were guiding her away from the nightmare that had consumed her for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of peace, as if the darkness no longer had any hold on her. The suffocating weight lifted from her chest, and her breath came easier. But that peace didn't last long. In an instant, the light flickered, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Emily found herself falling, her body tumbling through the air with nothing to grasp onto. The sensation was like plummeting into an endless abyss, and for a split second, she thought she might never stop falling. Then, with a harsh thud, her feet hit the ground. She gasped, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled to regain her balance. The air around her was thick and heavy, the familiar scent of stale dust and mildew filling her nostrils. The sound of the bus's old engine hummed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. "No, not again," Emily whispered under her breath, fear creeping up her spine. She knew exactly where she was. She was back on the bus. The same bus. The same nightmare. Her eyes darted around, the dimly lit interior revealing nothing but empty seats, the curtains drawn tightly, and the shadows lingering in the corners. The seats, once filled with the innocent chatter of the children, now sat eerily still, as if frozen in time. The bus, once a symbol of normalcy, had transformed into something twisted, something malevolent. The walls of the vehicle seemed to close in on her, pressing her with an invisible force. Emily's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the seat in front of her. The bus was moving slowly, steadily, though she had no idea how or why. The windows were fogged over, obscuring her view of the outside world. The bus's engine roared louder now, echoing in her ears as the vehicle lurched forward. She tried to steady her breath, but the panic clawed at her once more. She needed to understand what was happening. Was this some kind of cruel, twisted loop? Was she trapped here, doomed to ride this haunted bus for eternity? Suddenly, the lights flickered above her. The interior of the bus went dark for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of soft, eerie laughter, faint but growing louder. It was coming from the back of the bus. Her blood ran cold. Emily turned slowly, her heart racing, and there, at the very back of the bus, she saw it. A figure. Not quite human, but not entirely monstrous either. It was standing there, just beyond the reach of the dim lights, watching her. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but Emily could feel its eyes burning into her soul. The laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it stepped toward her. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it continued to approach her, its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if savoring each moment. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her hands searching for something, anything, to defend herself. But there was nothing, just the cold, hard metal of the bus and the unyielding darkness pressing in from all sides. The figure stopped just a few feet away from her, its presence overwhelming. It stood there for a moment, its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying her, sizing her up. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it spoke. "You can't escape, Emily. You belong to us now." The words sent a chill down her spine, and Emily's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She felt the weight of the figure's gaze on her, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere around her was alive, breathing, and hungry. Emily's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to stay calm. She couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, win. She couldn't let it consume her like it had consumed the others. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice shaking with fear and defiance. She didn't know what was happening or why, but she wasn't going to let it take her without a fight. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, its face still hidden in shadow. "You can scream all you want, but it won't help you. You've already been marked." Emily froze. Marked? Her heart skipped a beat as she looked down at her hand. There on her wrist was a strange, glowing symbol, something she hadn't seen before. It was as if it had been burned into her skin, the edges glowing faintly in the dim light of the bus. "No," she whispered, horrified. "No, this can't be happening." The figure chuckled softly, its voice low and menacing. "It's already too late." Emily's blood ran cold as the bus jolted forward again, the engine roaring to life. The figure slowly advanced toward her, its footsteps now echoing in perfect rhythm with the bus's acceleration. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The laughter continued to grow louder, more mocking, and Emily felt the darkness closing in once more. The bus seemed to stretch on forever, an endless tunnel of despair. She could hear the whispers now, dozens of them, all speaking at once, as if the very walls of the bus were alive with voices. "Help! Get out! Run. Stay. Don't leave. The voices blended together, each one more desperate than the last. And through it all, the figure remained, its eyes glowing, its grin widening. Emily's mind spun, and she realized with sickening clarity that she had never truly left the bus. She had never escaped. She had simply been pulled back in. And this time, she wasn't alone. The descent into madness. The bus rumbled on through the dark night, its wheels grinding against the asphalt in an endless, monotonous rhythm. Emily's heart raced as she stood frozen in place, unable to look away from the figure at the back of the bus. The laughter echoed in her ears, reverberating through her skull, making her feel as if her mind were unraveling. It was like an unholy symphony, each note twisting and distorting her thoughts further. The figure took another step toward her, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its hunt. Emily could feel the weight of its presence pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if it had become heavy with the weight of all the souls the bus had claimed before her. Emily's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. How had she ended up back here? Was it real, or was she trapped in some kind of nightmare? She glanced down at her hand again, still glowing with the strange symbol that had appeared out of nowhere. The mark, like an invisible thread, seemed to bind her to the very essence of this cursed bus. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from fear. The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it tilted its head to one side, its face still hidden in the shadows. But Emily could feel its eyes upon her, piercing through her, seeing deep into her soul. She had to get out. She had to escape. The bus, however, seemed to have other plans. It lurched again, the engine roaring to life with a terrifying guttural growl. The windows rattled, and the floor beneath her feet trembled, as if the very structure of the bus was alive and hungry. "You're not leaving," the figure said, its voice deep and guttural, its breath cold and oppressive. "You're just another lost soul now, Emily. Another piece of the puzzle." The words sent a shock of cold terror through her veins. Lost. Puzzle. What did it mean? What was this bus? What was its purpose? She turned her gaze to the front of the bus, but the driver's seat was empty. The steering wheel turned slowly of its own accord, the motion unnatural, as if something unseen was controlling it. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating a road that seemed to stretch on endlessly, disappearing into the void ahead. Emily stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt trapped, cornered by the weight of the darkness, surrounded by the oppressive silence that had fallen over the bus. The voices had stopped, but the sense of dread lingered, suffocating her. The figure was only a few feet away now, its form becoming clearer with each passing moment. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated in unnatural proportions. Its hands, long and bony, reached out toward her with the slow, deliberate movements of a spider weaving its web. Emily's legs were shaking, but she forced herself to move. She couldn't stand there any longer, not with that thing coming closer. She ran toward the door, desperate to escape, but the moment she reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. "No!" she screamed, banging her fists against the door, her panic rising with each futile attempt to break free. The figure was now right behind her, its breath hot against the back of her neck. Emily could feel its presence, like a cold hand pressing against her spine. It was almost as if it were savoring her fear, relishing every moment of her suffering. "You think you can run?" the figure whispered in her ear, its voice soft but dripping with malice. "You're already here. There's no escaping the bus. It's too late for you." The bus jolted once again, and Emily's body was thrown forward, crashing into the aisle. The figure took another step, and Emily could feel its fingers brush against her hair, icy and unnatural. A chill ran down her spine as her mind screamed for her to get up, to run, but her body refused to obey. She pushed herself up, her hands slick with sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. There had to be a way out. There had to be. She had to break free from this nightmare. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily forced herself to her feet. Her head spun, her vision blurred, but she focused on the door. If she could just get out, she could escape whatever this was. She had to. The figure behind her moved again, this time faster. It reached out for her, its cold fingers wrapping around her wrist in a vice-like grip. Emily gasped, her body jerking as she tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. "You belong to us now," the figure hissed, its breath cold against her ear. "You are one of us. You'll never escape." "No!" Emily screamed, her voice breaking. Let me go. She twisted and struggled, her heart racing in a frenzy of fear and desperation. She couldn't let this thing have her. She couldn't let it take her soul. In a final, desperate attempt, she yanked her wrist free from the figure's grip, her fingers slipping from its cold touch. She stumbled toward the front of the bus, her eyes scanning for an escape, but the darkness was closing in around her, swallowing her whole. The figure's laughter echoed again, this time louder, more maniacal. It was mocking her, relishing in her fear. As Emily reached the front of the bus, she heard the doors open with an eerie creak. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what lay outside. But she didn't care anymore. She had to escape. She ran. The final descent. The cold night air hit Emily like a slap as she bolted through the open door, her heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't afford to. The moment she set foot on the pavement, her legs felt like they were made of lead, her body trembling uncontrollably from the shock of everything that had happened. The ground beneath her felt unstable, as though it were shifting with every step she took. The bus door slammed shut behind her with a thunderous bang, but Emily didn't pause. She ran, her lungs burning, her breath ragged, as if something was chasing her, urging her to flee. She didn't dare look back. The fear of seeing that grotesque figure still lurking in the shadows kept her eyes locked straight ahead. As she ran, she could feel the ground beneath her feet grow softer, the familiar roughness of the pavement giving way to something deeper, more unsettling. The dirt beneath her feet was slick, almost like wet mud, but Emily didn't slow down. She didn't care. The air felt thick with dread, like the very atmosphere was pressing in on her, suffocating her with every breath she took. She reached a small clearing, the moonlight barely breaking through the dense canopy of trees overhead. The world around her felt distorted, warped. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisting and reaching out toward her like skeletal hands. The once familiar road she had been running on now seemed to be an endless maze, a path that spiraled into nowhere. Emily's heart raced even faster as she looked around. There was no sign of the bus, no sign of the figure, but the dread, the palpable sense of unease, clung to her like a shadow. She stopped, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape. A soft whisper reached her ears, so faint she almost couldn't hear it. Emily! Her body froze at the sound of her name. The voice was familiar, but it didn't belong here. It was cold, eerie, and filled with malice. She whipped around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing behind her. Just the silent trees and the shadowed path. But that whisper, it had come from somewhere. Another whisper, louder this time. You can't escape. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as a wave of cold dread washed over her. The voice was getting closer. She wasn't alone. She spun around again, her eyes darting from one tree to another, searching for any sign of movement. And then she saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the clearing, shrouded in darkness. Its silhouette was tall and unnaturally thin, the limbs elongated like a grotesque mannequin. Emily's pulse quickened. She knew what it was. The thing from the bus, the thing that had followed her. She could feel its presence, looming over her like a nightmare that had come to life. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were frozen to the spot. She couldn't move. The fear had rooted her to the earth, as if the ground itself had claimed her as its own. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. It was closer now, so close she could see the twisted shape of its face, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. Its mouth was stretched in a grin that wasn't human, the teeth sharp and uneven, like a creature that had never known warmth. You belong to us, the figure said, its voice low and guttural, like the growl of a beast. You can never escape. You will never leave this place. Emily's breath hitched. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, the terror clawing at her chest. She had to get away. She had to fight. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the locket her grandmother had given her. The locket, the one that had always been her source of comfort. She pulled it out, her hands shaking as she gripped it tightly. Without thinking, Emily ran toward the figure. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she couldn't just stand there. She couldn't let it take her. The figure's grin widened, and it stepped toward her, its long fingers outstretched, ready to seize her. But Emily didn't stop. She raised the locket high, holding it out in front of her like a shield. The moment the locket came into contact with the figure, a blinding light erupted from it. The light was so bright that Emily had to shield her eyes, but the figure recoiled, its body jerking back as if the light had burned it. "No!" it screeched, its voice turning into a shriek of pure rage. "You can't." But the words were cut off as the light intensified, the figure's form flickering like a fading shadow. Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing as the light continued to pulse, pushing the figure further and further away. The darkness around her began to lift, the oppressive weight of fear and dread slowly dissipating. The figure's form began to dissolve, its twisted body evaporating into the air like smoke, leaving nothing but a whisper of its presence. "This isn't over," the voice hissed from the void, fading into silence. Emily stood frozen, her breath ragged as she stared at the spot where the figure had been. The clearing was silent now, the air thick with tension, but there was no sign of the creature. It was gone. For now. The last step. Emily stood alone in the clearing, her hands trembling as she clutched the locket, which was now cool to the touch. The darkness around her seemed to press in, but the air was no longer as heavy. The oppressive dread that had clung to her for so long had begun to dissipate, like fog lifting in the morning light. But something still gnawed at her insides, an unsettling feeling that wouldn't let go. She had escaped the creature, for now, but the voice, the threat, echoed in her mind. "This isn't over." The words lingered, dark and foreboding, like a promise of something far worse. She took a shaky breath, her mind racing with questions. Had she truly escaped? Or had she merely delayed the inevitable? The things she had seen, the horrors she had faced, seemed impossible, but the scars left behind, emotional and physical, were undeniable. The clearing around her felt both unfamiliar and familiar, as if time itself had been twisted, turned upside down. The trees were taller now, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She could still hear the faintest whispers in the wind, distant voices calling her name. But Emily didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She had to keep moving. With slow, deliberate steps, she began to walk. The moonlight shone through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the path ahead of her. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing she could hear now, each step echoing in the silence. The night seemed endless, as if it stretched out forever, the road winding and twisting, leading her further into the unknown. Every step she took felt like a step deeper into a nightmare, yet she couldn't stop. She couldn't let the fear take over. But no matter how far she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The road ahead seemed to stretch on for miles, but in the distance, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. There, at the end of the path, was a faint light. It flickered like a dying candle, casting a weak, trembling glow into the darkness. Without thinking, Emily quickened her pace, her pulse quickening as she moved toward the light. She had to reach it. It had to be an escape. It had to be something, anything, other than the suffocating darkness she had just escaped. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, more intense, until it felt like the sun itself was rising just beyond the trees. She could hear the sound of something, footsteps, coming toward her. Her heart skipped a beat. "Emily." The voice was soft, gentle, like a whisper on the wind. But there was something about it, something that wasn't right. She stopped in her tracks, her body frozen with fear. She didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded so familiar, like a loved one calling out to her in distress. "Emily, come back." The voice was closer now, just ahead, and Emily could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She wanted to run, to flee, but she was rooted to the spot. The light ahead flickered again, casting eerie shadows in every direction. A figure emerged from the light, stepping slowly into the clearing. It was a woman, a familiar face, but Emily couldn't place her. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, her lips parted in a silent scream. "It's not over, Emily," the woman said, her voice trembling with terror. Before Emily could react, the woman's form began to distort. Her features stretched and twisted, her body elongating into something monstrous. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure transformed into the same horrifying creature from the bus, its twisted grin now plastered across the woman's face. "You can never leave," the creature hissed. The ground beneath Emily's feet trembled, and the trees around her seemed to sway as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her ears, urging her to look back. But Emily didn't. She couldn't. The figure was closing in, its eyes glowing with malicious intent. "You belong here," the creature growled, its voice now a guttural snarl. In a split second, Emily acted without thinking. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the locket once more. This time, she didn't hesitate. She held it out in front of her, and a blinding light erupted from it, brighter than ever before. The creature recoiled, screeching in pain as the light consumed it. But this time the light didn't fade. It grew brighter and brighter, until it enveloped everything around her. The clearing, the trees, the path, all of it disappeared into a void of white light. And then Emily felt herself being pulled away, her body weightless as the light swallowed her whole. In the blink of an eye, the light vanished, and Emily found herself standing in the middle of an empty road. The trees were gone. The path was gone. The creature was gone. Everything was silent. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Emily looked around, confused, her heart still pounding in her chest. Was it over? Was she free? A faint glimmer of dawn appeared on the horizon, the first rays of light breaking through the darkness. Emily felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She was alive. She had made it out. She had survived. But then, as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw something in the distance. A shadow moving slowly, stalking her every step. It wasn't over. Not yet.